What if the most dangerous place on earth once looked like the safest place to raise a family? In the early years, Wittenoom did not feel cursed. It felt hopeful. Tucked deep in the red, sun-burned heart of Western Australia, surrounded by rugged gorges and endless sky, Wittenoom emerged as a promise. A town carved out of nothing, offering steady jobs, modern houses, schools, sports fields, and a future that seemed secure in a harsh and isolated land. For newcomers arriving in the 1940s and 1950s, Wittenoom felt almost miraculous. After hours of driving through barren terrain, the sight of neat streets, green lawns, and freshly painted homes felt unreal. Children rode bikes along quiet roads. Families gathered for barbecues under wide blue skies. Workers returned home, covered in dust, tired but proud, believing they were part of something important, something productive, something necessary. The mine was the heart of everything. Blue asbestos mines from the surrounding hills was considered valuable, essential, and safe enough. It was used in construction, insulation, ships, factories, and homes across the world. In Wittenoom, it meant employment, it meant wages, it meant stability. For many families, it meant escape from poverty and uncertainty elsewhere. There was laughter in the evenings, cricket matches on weekends, school mornings filled with noise and movement. The town had a hospital, shops, a hotel, a cinema. On the surface, Wittenoom looked like a success story of industrial progress, a symbol of how humans could tame hostile landscapes and build thriving communities where none had existed before. But woven into every part of that daily life was something unseen, something so small it could not be felt, tasted, or smelled. It floated in the air, settled on windowsills, clung to clothes, filled lungs without resistance. It coated playgrounds and schoolyards. It drifted through open doors and rested in bedrooms where families slept. No alarms sounded. No warning signs were posted. No one told parents to keep their children indoors. No one told workers that the dust covering their skin carried a price that would not be paid immediately, but slowly, silently, and decades later. The mine trucks rumbled day and night, releasing clouds of fine blue dust into the air. Tailings were piled openly around the town. Children slid down them like sand dunes. Residents used the waste material to pave driveways, level gardens, and fill yards. It was free, plentiful, and considered harmless. In fact, it was encouraged. From the outside, Wittenoom appeared clean, organized, and alive. From the inside, it was already becoming something else entirely. A place where time itself was working against its people. A town where the danger was not an explosion, a collapse, or a sudden disaster, but a delayed sentence written into the air. The most unsettling part is this: nothing felt wrong. There was no single moment when people realized they were in danger. No dramatic turning point. Life continued normally. People fell in love, married, had children, made plans. The future still felt wide open. And that is what makes Wittenoom different from most ghost towns. It did not die because people left in panic. It did not vanish after a single catastrophic event. Its destruction was slow, methodical, and invisible. The town was already doomed long before anyone noticed the first signs of illness, long before the first unexplained death, long before questions were asked. Every laugh, every breath, every ordinary day carried something lethal within it. And the cruelest part is that Wittenoom did not look like a place that needed saving. It looked like a place that had already succeeded, and yet, beneath the calm surface, the countdown had already begun, because the dust never stopped drifting, and no one had told them what it really was. If this story already feels unsettling, it's because understanding what really happened in places like Wittenoom matters more than it seems. This is not just about an abandoned town, but about decisions, silence, and consequences that can repeat themselves anywhere. Take a moment to leave a comment sharing what shocked you the most so far, or what you think people should have been told back then. Your perspective adds another layer to this investigation, and it helps this kind of story reach more people. If this content is making you think differently about so-called progress, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story and others like it. At first, the dust was just part of life. It was everywhere. But so was the heat, the red earth, and the isolation. In Wittenoom, dust meant work. It meant productivity. It meant money flowing into a town that existed only because the mine never stopped. When trucks rolled out of the gorge, they carried more than ore. They released fine blue fibers into the air, so light they hovered for hours, drifting through streets, homes, and schools as if they belonged there. People noticed it, of course. Clothes came home, coated in a pale powder. Windowsills needed constant wiping. The wind lifted clouds from the tailings piles and pushed them through open doors and cracks in the walls. But nothing about it felt urgent. There was no smell, no sting in the eyes, no immediate pain. Compared to the dangers people expected from mining, caverns, explosions, machinery, this dust seemed harmless, almost gentle. Children played in it without fear. They built forts in the tailings, rolled down slopes of waste rock, and came home laughing, faces and hair dusted blue. Parents washed their clothes at night, shook out the sheets, and thought nothing of it. The dust was simply part of the environment, like sand at the beach or coal soot in an industrial city. Ordinary, familiar, easy to dismiss. What made the danger so effective was time. Nothing happened right away. No one collapsed in the streets. No mass illness swept through the town. Weeks passed, then months, then years, and life continued uninterrupted. This absence of immediate consequences trained people to stop asking questions. The human brain is wired to respond to visible threats, not delayed ones. When there is no instant punishment, the behavior feels safe. The mine operators understood this psychology well. Production targets were met. Exports increased. Blue asbestos from Wittenoom was shipped across Australia and overseas, used in buildings, ships, and factories. Demand stayed strong, and with demand came pressure to keep mining at full capacity. Dust control was minimal. Protective equipment was inconsistent. Warnings, when they existed at all, were vague and downplayed. Behind the scenes, medical literature already told a different story. As early as the 1930s, there were documented links between asbestos exposure and severe lung disease. Doctors had observed scarring of the lungs, chronic breathlessness, and cancers that appeared decades after exposure. These findings were not secrets locked away in obscure journals. They were known within medical and industrial circles. But knowledge does not automatically become action, especially when action threatens profit. In Wittenoom, the dust remained officially manageable. Any concern could be reframed as speculation. Any sick worker could be labeled an unfortunate exception. After all, people got sick everywhere. That ambiguity created a perfect shield. Without undeniable proof in the present, responsibility could always be postponed. The town itself reinforced the illusion of safety. The hospital treated routine injuries and illnesses. The school functioned normally. Social events continued. If the place were truly dangerous, people reasoned, surely something obvious would have happened by now. The lack of visible disaster became evidence not of safety, but of denial. Over time, the dust blended into memory. New arrivals accepted it as normal because everyone else did. Long-term residents stopped noticing it entirely. The mind adapts quickly to constant exposure. What once seemed strange became background noise. The invisible became ignored. This is how the most dangerous environments persist, not through force, but through normalization, not through lies shouted loudly, but through truths whispered too softly to disrupt daily life. In Wittenoom, the air itself became an accomplice. It carried death quietly, patiently, waiting for years, sometimes decades, before revealing its cost. By the time the first serious questions began to surface, the dust had already done its work. It had settled deep inside lungs. It had embedded itself where no washing, no medicine, no apology could reach. And still, from the outside, the town looked calm, alive, functional. The most unsettling realization is this: ignoring the dust was not stupidity. It was human. People trusted what they could see. They trusted routine. They trusted authority, and in doing so, they unknowingly accepted a threat that did not announce itself until it was far too late. What made Wittenoom especially dangerous was not just the dust itself, but how completely it blended into moments of happiness. This was not a town defined by fear or desperation. It was defined by normal life, by routines, by laughter echoing through streets that should never have existed in the first place. Every morning, children walked to school under a sky that seemed endlessly open. Their shoes kicked up pale blue powder from the roads. At recess, they ran, fell, rolled, and laughed in playgrounds built directly on contaminated soil. Teachers wiped, chalkboards dusted with the same fibers drifting in from outside. No one imagined that classrooms were slowly becoming chambers of exposure. After school, the town came alive in familiar ways. Kids raced bicycles down quiet streets. Teenagers gathered near the river gorge. Families picnicked on weekends. The dust settled on food, on skin, on hair, and no one stopped to question it. Parents worried about scraped knees and sunburn, not microscopic fibers embedding themselves deep in young lungs. At the mine, workers joked through exhaustion. Many were proud of what they did. Mining was hard, dangerous work, but it paid well, and in a remote part of Australia, that mattered. Men finished shifts, covered head to toe in blue-gray powder, slapped each other on the back, laughed about the day, and climbed into trucks to head home. The dust followed them inside. Work clothes were shaken out on back porches. Boots were left near doors. Wives washed uniforms in sheared machines, breathing in fibers released into the air with every load. Babies crawled across floors that looked clean but were anything but. Exposure was not limited to the mine. It was domestic, intimate, constant. What made the situation even more disturbing is that warning signs did exist, but they were scattered and easy to dismiss. Some workers complained of shortness of breath. Others developed persistent coughs. A few men left town quietly, too sick to continue. But mining towns expect injuries and illness. Hard work always takes a toll. In Wittenoom, sickness blended into expectation. Doctors treated symptoms, not causes. A cough was just a cough. Fatigue was just fatigue. No one connected the pattern because the timeline did not make sense yet. Asbestos diseases do not strike immediately. They wait. They mature slowly inside the body, invisible and irreversible. By the time symptoms become undeniable, the damage is already done. Meanwhile, life moved forward. Weddings were planned. Babies were born. Houses were expanded. People invested emotionally in a future they believed was solid. The town council discussed improvements. The mine expanded operations. There was no emergency meeting, no evacuation order, no moment when sirens broke the illusion. This is the cruel genius of slow disaster. They allow people to adapt instead of escape. Every day without catastrophe feels like proof that everything is fine. Every ordinary moment reinforces the lie that tomorrow will look like today. Children grew up breathing poisoned air, unaware that their bodies were recording every breath. Some would leave Wittenoom years later, thinking they had escaped unharmed, only to fall ill decades after the town itself had emptied. Others would never leave at all. The laughter never sounded forced. The smiles were real, and that is what makes Wittenoom so unsettling. The town did not feel like a tragedy while it was happening. It felt like home. And while families built memories, something else was quietly building inside them. Layer by layer, breath by breath, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. By the time Wittenoom felt established and secure, the danger was no longer unknown. It was simply inconvenient. Long before the town's future was sealed, information already existed that should have changed everything. Reports, medical observations, internal warnings. None of them reached the people who needed them most. As early as the 1940s and 1950s, asbestos was no longer a mystery to science. Doctors had documented severe lung scarring in workers exposed to asbestos dust. Studies linked prolonged exposure to fatal diseases that did not appear immediately, but emerged years, sometimes decades later. These findings circulated through medical journals, industrial conferences, and government discussions. The problem was not ignorance. It was distance. Those making decisions were not the ones breathing the dust every day. Mine operators focused on output. Government departments balanced health concerns against economic value. Wittenoom was profitable. It supplied material considered essential for construction and industry. Shutting it down or heavily regulating it would cost money, jobs, and political capital. So the language softened. Risks became manageable. Exposure was described as within acceptable limits. The uncertainty of long-term effects was emphasized over the certainty of harm. If disease appeared decades later, responsibility could be delayed, diluted, or denied altogether. Internal correspondence revealed concern, but not urgency. Dust suppression was discussed, but rarely enforced. Protective equipment was mentioned, but inconsistently provided. Medical monitoring was minimal and poorly communicated. And crucially, the residents of Wittenoom were never fully informed. No public warning campaigns explained the risks to families. No clear instructions told parents to keep children away from tailings. No mandatory relocation was considered while the mine remained active. Instead, life continued as if silence itself were a solution. When workers fell ill, cases were treated individually, never as part of a larger pattern. Death certificates listed causes without context. The slow nature of asbestos-related disease allowed each tragedy to be isolated. One death did not trigger alarm. 10 did not either. Time blurred accountability. Government agencies visited the site. Inspectors observed conditions. Reports were filed, and then almost nothing changed. The mine stayed open. The town stayed populated. Production continued. This was not a single villain making a single decision. It was a system doing what systems often do when faced with uncomfortable truth. Delay, reframe, minimize, pass responsibility along a chain long enough that no one felt fully responsible for the outcome. For the people of Wittenoom, this silence was deadly. They trusted institutions designed to protect them. They assumed that if danger existed, someone would say something. Someone would intervene. Someone would act. No one did. And as years passed, the evidence that should have closed the mine grew stronger, not weaker. Yet the town remained. Families stayed. Children kept playing, and the dust kept drifting. The most disturbing question is not whether the danger was known. It is why knowing was not enough to stop it. If you were in charge, balancing profit, jobs, and human life, where would you have drawn the line? Share your thoughts in the comments. At first, the deaths did not seem connected. One man here, another there. A miner who struggled to breathe, a former worker who wasted away after leaving town. The timeline never felt urgent because it never moved fast. Years passed between exposure and consequence, and that delay became the greatest shield protecting those responsible. People in Wittenoom began to hear quiet rumors. Someone had moved away and fallen sick. A former co-worker could no longer climb stairs without gasping. A man barely in his 40s died of what doctors called a rare lung condition. The explanations were always vague. Pneumonia, heart failure, natural causes, bad luck. As the 1960s approached, the pattern became harder to ignore. Doctors started seeing patients with the same symptoms: severe breathlessness, chest pain, persistent coughing that never improved. X-rays revealed lungs stiffened and scarred beyond repair. In some cases, tumors appeared aggressive and untreatable. The word mesothelioma began to surface, still unfamiliar to most people, but devastatingly specific. What terrified families was not just the diagnosis, but the timing. Many of those falling ill had left Wittenoom years earlier. Some had lived healthy lives elsewhere before symptoms suddenly emerged. They could not understand how a place they barely remembered could still reach inside their bodies and destroy them decades later. There was no cure. Once symptoms appeared, the outcome was usually inevitable. Decline was slow and cruel. Victims lost the ability to work, then to move freely, then to breathe without pain. Loved ones watched helplessly as strong men became fragile, gasping shadows of themselves. The town issue existed during this period. People were still raising children there, while former residents were dying far away. That separation in time created confusion and denial. How could a place that still looked alive be responsible for deaths happening somewhere else years later? Authorities continued to avoid direct language. They spoke of correlation, not causation. They called the evidence concerning not conclusive. Meanwhile, the body count quietly grew. Former miners' wives who washed contaminated clothes, children who had played in the dust. Exposure was broader than anyone had admitted. Families began asking questions that no one wanted to answer. How many people were affected? How long had this been known? Why were warnings never given? Why had the mind stayed open? By the time these questions gained momentum, the damage was irreversible. The poison was already embedded in lungs and tissues. No evacuation could undo decades of exposure. No apology could reverse what had been set in motion. The town had not exploded. It had not collapsed. It had not burned. It had simply poisoned its people slowly enough that no single moment felt like an emergency. Wittenoom was still functioning, but its former residents were dying one by one, scattered across the country, carrying the town inside them like a delayed curse. By the time the danger was undeniable, Wittenoom did not shut down. It adapted, and that decision sealed its reputation as one of the most disturbing ghost towns in history. The mine continued operating even as evidence mounted that staying meant exposure, illness, and eventually death. Life did not stop. It normalized the risk. The asbestos mine remained the economic backbone of the region. Closing it would have meant admitting failure, accepting liability, and destroying livelihoods overnight. So instead of evacuation, there were half measures. Production slowed at times. Safety discussions happened behind closed doors. But the town itself stayed open, inhabited, breathing. Workers still clocked in. Trucks still hauled ore. Families still lived in company housing. Children still attended school. The difference was subtle but devastating. Now, the town was operating with knowledge that something was wrong, yet without the courage to act on it fully. Warnings, when they came, were fragmented and inconsistent. Some workers were advised to wear masks, often inadequate and poorly fitted. Others received no protection at all. Dust suppression efforts were sporadic and largely ineffective. The blue fibers still floated freely through streets and homes, unchanged by policy language. What made this phase especially cruel was that many residents sensed danger but felt trapped. Jobs elsewhere were scarce. Leaving meant financial ruin for some families. Staying meant continued exposure to something they could not see or fight. The choice was never presented honestly. It was framed as manageable risk instead of unavoidable harm. During this period, a new reality took hold. People began to speak quietly about Wittenoom as a place you did not stay forever. Families planned to leave someday. Workers promised themselves they would only do a few more years. Parents told themselves their children would be safe once they moved away. But asbestos does not respect plans. It does not wait for convenient timing. Every additional day added another layer of exposure, another irreversible deposit inside the body. The town became a paradox. Officially open, functioning, listed on maps, and yet unofficially condemned. A place where the future had already been compromised, even if the present still looked normal. As more former residents fell ill, the truth spread through word of mouth faster than any official announcement. Fear grew, but so did fatigue. When danger becomes constant, it stops shocking. It becomes background noise. That is when it becomes most lethal. Eventually, the mine closed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It faded out under the weight of evidence, lawsuits, and growing public awareness. But by then, the damage was complete. The town had outlived its people. Wittenoom did not fail because no one knew. It failed because knowing was not enough to overcome inertia, profit, and fear of responsibility. When the decision finally came, it did not arrive with sirens or public apologies. It came quietly, bureaucratically, and far too late. Authorities no longer spoke about saving Wittenoom. Instead, they began preparing to forget it. The mine was closed, but the town remained. And that was the problem. By now, Wittenoom was no longer just dangerous. It was indefensible. The scale of contamination was so severe that no cleanup could make it safe. Millions of tons of asbestos tailings were scattered across the valley, woven into soil, roads, yards, and riverbeds. Every strong wind lifted lethal fibers back into the air. Time was not healing the place. It was preserving the threat. So the strategy changed. Rather than warning people loudly, officials chose distance. Roads were rerouted. Signs were removed. Services were cut one by one. Power lines came down. Water supply was disconnected. Schools and hospitals closed. Wittenoom stopped being supported, not because it was empty, but because it was too dangerous to justify keeping alive. The town's name was removed from maps. Official documents stopped referencing it as a destination. Emergency services were instructed not to enter unless absolutely necessary. Tourists were discouraged, not with explanations, but with silence. If Wittenoom disappeared from public consciousness, the problem would fade with it. For the last remaining residents, this was a second betrayal. They had stayed through uncertainty, illness, and fear. Now they were being erased. No compensation that truly matched the cost. No memorial that honored the dead. Just a slow withdrawal of recognition. Even after most people left, Witt continued to kill. Former residents developed mesothelioma decades later. Some had not returned to the town since childhood. Others had passed through briefly, unknowingly breathing air that would one day suffocate them from the inside. The poison had traveled with them, invisible and patient. The land itself became untouchable. Demolition was considered, but disturbing structures would release more fibers. Cleanup was estimated to cost billions and still could not guarantee safety. The most effective solution was abandonment. Let nature reclaim it. Let time bury it. Let memory soften the edges. But memory did not cooperate. Wittenoom became infamous, labeled the most dangerous ghost town in the world. A place so toxic that governments preferred it forgotten rather than fixed. Its absence on maps became part of its story. This was not just abandonment. It was an attempt to rewrite reality, to remove a mistake by pretending it no longer existed. And yet, the deaths continued to surface, one diagnosis at a time, long after the town itself was officially gone. Wittenoom did not become harmless when people left. In some ways, it became more dangerous with no one maintaining the land. No barriers, no active containment. The town was left exposed to the same forces that had always carried death through it: wind, erosion, and time. The asbestos was never confined to the mine alone. It had been spread deliberately across the town for years. Tailings were used to level roads, fill playgrounds, pave driveways, and reinforce riverbanks. Entire neighborhoods were built on contaminated ground. When buildings collapsed or deteriorated, their materials mixed back into the soil, releasing fibers all over again. Unlike chemical spills or radiation that decay over time, asbestos does not break down. Its fibers remain lethal indefinitely. They fracture into smaller and smaller pieces, becoming easier to inhale, not harder. Each strong gust of wind lifts invisible clouds from the valley floor and carries them through the gorge, across abandoned streets, and into the open desert beyond. This is why Wittenoom is not just abandoned, but restricted. Authorities do not warn people with dramatic language. They simply advise them not to go. No camping, no sightseeing, no exploration. Emergency services avoid the area. Cleanup crews will not enter. Even demolition is considered too dangerous because disturbing the structures would release more fibers into the air. And yet, people still go. Some are tourists chasing extreme destinations. Others are explorers drawn to forbidden places. A few are former residents returning to see what remains of their childhood. The buildings look quiet. The streets look empty. The danger looks imaginary. That illusion is deadly. A single visit may not feel like a risk. A short stay does not cause immediate symptoms. And that is exactly why the threat persists. Exposure does not announce itself, it records itself. The body remembers long after the mind forgets. Scientists and health authorities agree on one fact. There is no safe level of asbestos exposure. None. One fiber can lodge deep in the lungs and remain there for life. The more fibers inhaled, the higher the risk. Wittenoom offers exposure without warning, without protection, and without urgency. This makes it unique among ghost towns. Most abandoned places are dangerous because they are unstable, collapsing, or remote. Wittenoom is dangerous because it looks harmless while actively poisoning anyone who enters. Its emptiness is not safety. It is concealment. Even today, decades after the last residents left, new cases of asbestos-related disease continued to be traced back to Wittenoom. Some victims never worked in the mine. Some never lived there. A brief visit, a childhood trip, a few days passing through, that was enough. The town has outlived its population, but not its impact. It continues to exist inside medical records, court cases, and death certificates. Long after the house is crumbled, Wittenoom remained present where it mattered most, inside human lungs. Wittenoom is not an isolated tragedy. It is part of a pattern that repeats whenever profit, distance, and delayed consequences collide across the world. Other towns followed a disturbingly similar path. Places where danger was known, minimized, and allowed to persist because its effects did not appear immediately. In Libby, Montana, vermiculite mining exposed entire communities to asbestos contamination. Like Wittenoom, dust settled into homes, schools, and public spaces. Residents lived normal lives for years before illness surfaced. Decades later, the town recorded some of the highest rates of asbestos-related disease in the United States. The warnings existed. The response came too late. In Casale Monferrato, Italy, an asbestos cement factory poisoned generations. Workers brought fibers home on their clothes. Families were exposed without ever stepping inside a mini. Children grew up breathing contamination embedded in their own walls. Mesothelioma became so common that it reshaped the town's identity. Accountability arrived only after thousands were already affected. In South Africa, asbestos mining towns were abandoned without cleanup, leaving rural communities exposed long after operations ceased. The mines closed, but the fibers remained. Illness followed migration patterns as workers carried exposure with them into cities and villages. Far from the original source, these places share a disturbing truth. The danger was not invisible to everyone. It was invisible to those without power. Reports existed, research existed, patterns emerged, but action was delayed because acknowledging harm would require responsibility, compensation, and fundamental change. What connects these towns is not geography or industry, but silence. Silence. Silence is a strategy. Silence is a way to stretch time until accountability felt distant or irrelevant. Wittenoom became the most extreme example because the contamination was total. The land, the air, the town itself became a hazard zone. But the logic that allowed it to happen is not unique. It thrives wherever the victims are remote, economically dependent, or easily forgotten. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other places are following the same trajectory right now? How many communities are breathing something harmful today that will only be acknowledged decades from now? And how often are we reassured by the absence of immediate disaster? The ghost towns of the future may already be alive, thriving, and officially safe. What makes Wittenoom terrifying is not that it was destroyed, but that it was allowed to destroy quietly. If history repeats itself in slow motion, will we recognize it in time, or only after the damage is done? Wittenoom does not belong to the past. It exists in a permanent state of aftermath, a place where the disaster never truly ended, only changed form. The streets are empty, the houses collapsing, the signs removed, but the danger remains active, waiting, unchanged by time or neglect. Unlike other ghost towns, Wittenoom cannot be There will be no restoration, no revival, no safe return. The land itself has been condemned. Scientists, doctors, and authorities agree on one brutal fact. There's no way to make it safe. Any attempt to rebuild, excavate, or even clean would only release more asbestos fibers into the air, amplifying the harm rather than reducing it. This makes Wittenoom something rare and deeply unsettling. A place erased not because it failed economically, but because it succeeded at a cost too high to reverse. The very resource that gave it life is the reason it must remain dead. And yet, the town continues to claim victims. Long after its evacuation, people are still being diagnosed with asbestos-related diseases, traced directly back to Some are former residents. Some are children who once played there. Some are visitors who stayed briefly, believing abandonment meant safety. For them, the town was not over. It was only delayed. There are no fences strong enough to contain no warning signs that fully communicate its threat, because the danger does not announce itself. It does not cause pain immediately. It settles quietly, waiting years or decades before revealing what it has done. This is why Wittenoom stands as a warning far greater than a single town. It exposes the true cost of decisions made in silence, of risks accepted because they were inconvenient to confront, of progress pursued without accountability. The town may never appear on maps again, but it remains embedded in medical records, court cases, and family histories. It lives on in every diagnosis that traces back to a breath taken there long ago. Wittenoom forces a question that has no comfortable answer. If a place becomes too dangerous to acknowledge, does erasing it solve anything? Or does it only ensure that the lesson is learned again somewhere else by someone new? If you stayed until the end of this story, take a moment to pause and think about what Wittenoom really represents. This wasn't just a ghost town. It was a warning written in silence, prophet, and delayed consequences. If this story made you question how many dangers are ignored until it's too late, leave a comment below and write, "Wittenoom should never be forgotten." Your comment helps keep these stories alive and visible. If this investigation mattered to you, don't forget to leave a like to support deep research stories like this, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next dark chapter we uncover. And now, continue the journey by watching the next video appearing on your screen, another place, another mystery, another truth that refuses to stay buried.